Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. My name is Rachel Ginsberg, and I'm a 40-year-old non-binary woman with a buzz cut, wearing gold aviator style glasses, a gold chain, and a green t-shirt. I am the founding director of the Interaction Lab at Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum. Ryan King is with me. He will introduce himself momentarily. And we're here to talk about activating Smithsonian Open Access, a creative commissioning program launched in the spring of 2021 by the Interaction Lab that funded 7 creative technology teams through an open call for digital interactions with the Smithsonian's Open Access data set. Sorry, controls are fun. So, in case you're not familiar with the Interaction Lab, we are a visitor experience focused R&D program at Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum in New York. The lab was created to lead the development of a reimagined visitor experience at Cooper Hewitt, but also while convening thinkers and doers in the design world and the museum sector to explore futures for museum experience. What you're seeing on the screen right now is an image of actually my hand holding this little sort of mock-up remote control thing that we created in one of our workshops. And behind my hand is a bunch of sketches that we generated in some early kind of user experience workshops for the museum. Since we launched the Interaction Lab in fall of 2019, we've injected new ideas into Cooper Hewitt's work through internal workshopping and strategy, a highly participatory public program series merging interactive design and museum practice, and a commissioning program that engages the design community as creative collaborators, which, as I mentioned, that's actually what we're here to talk about today. Next, I'm going to hand it to Ryan just for a minute, and he's going to talk you through a little bit about the background of Smithsonian Open Access.
Great. Thank you, Rachel. Hello, and thank everyone again for joining us today. My name is Ryan King, Program Manager for the Smithsonian Open Access Initiative. I'm a white male wearing a green shirt, blue-rimmed glasses, and seated in front of a wall with bookshelves, plants, and artwork here in Washington, D.C. We were thrilled to work with Rachel and the team at Cooper Hewitt on the Activating Smithsonian Open Access program, and participating along the way, helping with mentoring the teams on accessibility and helping fund evaluation of the process itself. But first, I wanted to give a little bit of background information on open access here at the Smithsonian. The Smithsonian launched open access February 25th of 2020, releasing 2.8 million 2D and 3D assets as CC0 public domain, all in the hopes that people around the world could experience our collections and create new works using our assets. And our goal really was to establish an open foundation to enable projects and partnerships to build upon. So the staff across the Smithsonian contribute to that goal by continuing to grow our open collections from that initial 2.8 million 2 years ago to now just under 4 million assets. You can learn more by visiting si.edu/open-access. The current slide on the right displays a collection of open access assets from across the Smithsonian. And on the left hand of the slide, some metrics, including that 3.9 million number of our total open access assets. Since launch to current date, there have been 70 million views of those assets, 2 million downloads, and all of that represents currently 29% of all Smithsonian digitized collections. Next slide, please. Both the Open Access Initiative and the Activating Smithsonian Open Access, or SOA, Creative Commissioning Project are components of the Smithsonian's overall strategy of being nimble and working towards making our knowledge available to every home and classroom. And I'll be speaking a bit more on how that aligns with overall strategic goals for the Smithsonian in a bit, but for now, I'm going to turn it back over to Rachel.
Thanks so much, Ryan. And thank you for that intro of open access. It's really helpful to have context. So back to SOA, to Activating Smithsonian Open Access. So supported by Verizon 5G Labs, who is our partner for ASOA, it was the first iteration of the lab's approach to creative commissioning. And so the slide on screen right now has black background and open call in big white letters with an exclamation point. The idea here was, rather than going through the standard request for proposal style process, which means, I mean, I'm sure many of you know this, most of you know this, but the idea of an RFP, or request for proposal, is offering a design challenge or an opportunity to a select group of design firms, oftentimes people who we might know already or firms that are well established. But ASOA intended to demonstrate the potential of a more open approach to platform development by engaging a community of creators beyond those who typically work on museum projects. So much like creative commissioning or commissioning is familiar to museums, oftentimes what is commissioned is material or art or objects to be on display, and not the actual platforms and tools that the museum is using to engage audiences. But in this particular area, we saw an opportunity, and we were really excited to have a collaborating partner who supported that plan. So the point of the open call in this case was to seek interactions with open access collections beyond passive, quote, looking experiences. And the idea of that really is that, being in museums, surrounded by precious objects, mostly what we do is look at them. That's sort of how museums work. Isn't the only way that they work, but a substantial part of many museum experiences is this idea of looking, and often looking with our eyes. And so thinking about what the potential is for open access assets in a digital environment, there's so much more that we can do with these assets, 2D and 3D, besides just looking at them. And so the idea of the ASOA open call was to encourage creators to propose ideas for interactions that take advantage of the incredible range of possibilities arising from digital collections with unrestricted creative use. So the kind of alchemy of open call meets open access. And really prodding folks to think more expansively about what's possible. So one of the most exciting things about ASOA ultimately is the diversity of thought that it represents. And so what you're seeing on screen right now, it's a collage of 7 images, one from each of the projects that we awarded. And so from web-based extended reality to multiplayer social learning, time and writing-based collections exploration tools, and even simulated echolocation, the ASOA prototypes speak to a wide range of audiences and interaction styles, very much living up to our ambitions for the program. Sorry, you might hear my dog in the background. She's a little excitable sometimes. The slide on screen right now shows an image from each of those 7 projects, as I mentioned. And so clockwise from top left, the first is Art Clock, digital interface on a tablet that's sitting on a wooden shelf. Butterfly is an augmented reality depiction of Smithsonian butterfly collections flying around a phone screen with a real-life garden background. There is a still image of a period room from Doorways into Open Access, which is an augmented reality app that depicts beautifully rendered period decor from kind of the Belle Epoque, which is the Parisian Gilded Age. Most of it's from Cooper Hewitt's collection, but not all. Next is a moonscape from Science VR Treasure Hunt's multiplayer game. In the middle, we have writing with open access, the interface, which is depicting keyword analyzed writing on the left, alongside a gallery style display of related open access images on the right. Then we have a 3D rendering of a bronze king's head from the Kingdom of Benin collections that was not previously available in 3 dimensions, but now is available, thanks to the team at Casting Memories. And then lastly, a 3D woolly mammoth skeleton that's part of the multimodal exhibition in Art Echo. Unfortunately, there isn't enough time for me to dive into each prototype in depth today, but I urge you to play with them and share your feedback. All of them are accessible from the ASOA homepage. I would say the simplest way to get to it is just to Google activating Smithsonian open access, and you will find the homepage on Cooper Hewitt's website that has links to all of the prototypes. You can try them all, except for Doorways into Open Access, which is an iPhone app. So the next thing that we wanted to discuss just briefly with you all today, and I know there's a lot of text on this slide, so we're not going to go through all of it in depth, but just really wanted to share a bit about the process that it took to make ASOA a reality. We had the first conversation about this program with our partners at Verizon 5G Labs in late June of 2020 and launched the prototypes in early August of 2021. So it was quite a long process. And really, you could break it down into 5 distinct phases: pre-planning, planning, awarding, build, and post-launch. And so just to take you through a little bit of what that looks like, we had a pre-planning phase that involved designing the program, developing a partnership agreement. And the reason I'm highlighting that in particular is because there are program terms in the pre-planning partnership agreement phase, which meant that in order to design the beginning of the relationship, we had to do a lot of program design, which is complicated because you're sort of not in it yet, but yet you have to understand all of the details. And then in the planning phase, once we got through recruitment of key staff and actual contracting, worked on developing a creative brief, including participant terms, designing the judging process and recruiting judges, hiring consultants for evaluation inclusive design, because we supported our teams all the way through with a robust evaluation thanks to the Open Access program, and also inclusive design mentorship from Sina Baram and Corey Timpson. And then open call marketing and promotion planning. So how are we actually going to get people to submit proposals for this program? And then the awarding phase, we actually launched the open call. We designed a virtual information session. We created an FAQ. We designed a mentorship program. We judged the proposals. We contracted with the finalists, and then went into a 12-week building phase. It was actually designed to be 10, but it ended up being a little bit longer. And during that time was when we executed the mentorship. We offered support for creative teams and program management, did a lot of communication with stakeholders. For those folks who are in the audience, from the Smithsonian, we did 7 simultaneous TRBs. For those of you who are not at the Smithsonian, that is a hefty compliance load that we understand being a part of a large institution, but it was a non-trivial investment of time and effort, certainly. And then also coordinated user testing for 7 prototypes and planned launch. And then, almost done. The post-launch is really ongoing promotion and data gathering about the prototypes, disseminating evaluation findings and lessons learned. Obviously, one of the reasons we're here today, and thank you so much for joining us. And then continuing to explore futures for the prototypes and for the kind of the approach to programming. So, what does that mean in terms of why this is different, perhaps, from a process that museums sometimes go through? Well, first, it's this idea of a pathway to scale, which looks a lot like the way that tech companies do their work out in the world outside of museums, which is, to define an idea, an opportunity, to invest a bit in kind of a prototype or a proof of concept, and then continue iterating, at which point you fund and scale. And so this is quite the same. So the diagram that is on the screen right now begins with an open call. There is a little bit of money injected, which in this case is in the form of a commission award. Then prototype happens, evaluation happens, and then funding on a larger scale, at which point scaling is an option. So it really gives us the opportunity to take this amazing, and Ryan's going to talk a lot more about this, but take this amazing set of assets like open access, throw some money at it to figure out how we can actually activate that. And then once we've evaluated the possibility for success, actually move it along. And so this next slide, there are over 60 people on this list. It is a long, long list of names. And I am not in any way putting this up to dissuade you from thinking about something like creative commissioning, but rather to highlight how incredible of a community now exists around this work. So in addition to the creators who are also on this list, and people who are not on this list were the 40 people who did user testing for us. So really there's 100 or so people invested in this program. That the opportunity to explore and experiment with this many people invested in the process from the very beginning is really exciting, because it's not just happening behind closed doors. It's actually a way to make the creative process and the development process part of a community effort, which is really exciting. And now I'm going to pass it to Ryan to talk a little bit about the relationship between open access and creative commissioning.
Thanks, Rachel. One of the things I think Rachel spoke to really was that community building aspect and component. And by having various teams to connect with, as well as the insights they bring, the new audiences and communities they bring along with them, and connecting them with various staff across the Smithsonian was a real highlight personally, and I think for our teams in particular, and something we hope to emulate more as we work at building creative storytelling that span museums and both across the Smithsonian and hopefully externally, as well as we collaborate with other GLAM or museum, library, archive spaces. We use these programs really to continue advancing core strategic goals across the Smithsonian, and all really in the same vein of moving towards greater reach, relevance, and impact. Next slide, please. Smithsonian Secretary Lonnie Bunch spoke yesterday in an all-staff meeting of the desire to position the Smithsonian to be as nimble as possible. And the ASOA project is one example of investigating what new ways of working with outside groups might look like. It's a flexible model that serves as an additional tool to our standard contracting procedures that Rachel mentioned, and allows for new fresh voices, perspectives, and talents, along with those new associated communities, to create alongside SI staff, rapidly prototyping a variety of ideas that we can scale. As I mentioned, we also try to grow not only our open access collections, but making the documentation and the platforms and frameworks and the API, in the sense, the application programming interface that allows third parties and university groups and really anyone who wants to tap into our network and code or work with our data and use our assets to create new digital experiences, all really focus more on audience-centric storytelling. It also advances our goals of greater accessibility practices and how we can better make those more holistic within the Smithsonian, but also hopefully share them with the larger sector and community. And also just this openness allows us to be nimble and facilitate more agile partnerships and funding. And so with that, I think it's a shining example of what we hope to continue doing at ASOA. And today we really bring this to you to think and hear about your feedback, your instant responses and thoughts and ideas of how you envision a creative commissioning project or process perhaps being realized within your work, or suggestions on how the Smithsonian can be creative in the ways that we advance towards these goals and strategies. Thanks, Rachel.
Thanks, Ryan. So yeah, just to close the presentation portion until we move into Q&A, is just to think about, like, what does the potential for creative commissioning look like? And a thing that I actually realized I forgot to mention that's pretty critical to the ASOA program and that's quite unique, that differs from a conventional contracting process, is that in this case, whereas if we were to use a request for proposal, we're essentially doing work for hire, which means that we are hiring people who then generate work that we own. In this case, because it was functioning a lot like a challenge, actually the creators retained ownership of the IP of their platforms, which really frames the Smithsonian as kind of an early stage investor in tools that can serve the sector beyond the Smithsonian. And so, you know, the potential for creative commissioning, at least to start, is to, you know, show the range of possible interactions with museum assets, but also to invest in the way that museums can interact with audiences beyond simply the tool that we might pay people to create to then become proprietary for the Smithsonian or for whichever Smithsonian museum is executing it. And so the kind of second point, which is in this case for Cooper Hewitt, but broadly speaking could apply to the Smithsonian broadly or any museum, to build community around design challenges and opportunity and create a closer connection between the museum and, in this case, the design world. But it really could be any world of you know, communities or creators that your museum wants to engage. But this idea that we can build community around challenges, that we don't need to treat challenges like the things that we solve behind closed doors just by ourselves, but we can actually present them to the world, figure out how, as you know, collectively we can address them. And hopefully the ways in which we address them actually kind of spill out into the wider sector. And so number three, expanding the range of creators who are building tools and experiences for the museum sector. So really this is where the open call fits in. So many people and amazing ideas kind of floating around out there that we don't know about. And so making sure that we're getting in front of creators and, you know, people who can build tools for us and with us that are different from the ones that we typically have access to. And then lastly, and this was something Ryan touched on, but I think important to really highlight, this program allowed us to put a wide variety of design practices to work without actually having to build competences internally. We had, we had web XR, we had augmented reality, we had video creation, we had rendering objects from 2D into 3D. We had a lot of really amazing skills at work on our assets and through this program to benefit those who did the work, but we actually didn't have to hire them. We didn't have to integrate them into our infrastructure, which, I mean, as Smithsonian folks know, is really complicated. So we see creative commissioning as a high potential, interesting approach that in no way would I claim to not be laborious, but the value of it is really quite exciting in terms of community building, in terms of trying out a multitude of ideas at once, not maybe taking, as Ryan was saying, and Secretary Bunch was saying, a more nimble approach to the way that we do things. So I'm gonna pause presenting and we're happy to take your questions. Sorry, looking for the questions now. Were there any proposals that were limited by the availability of digital material? There were. And there were also proposals that one of the questions that folks had, and sorry, I'm sort of thinking through how to answer this question. So a thing also to note is that there were 102 proposals overall, and we awarded 7 of them. And I would say, and Ryan would love you to weigh in on this too, but I would say that actually the strongest proposals identified a niche in the open access collections with a specific collection and had a very sort of targeted idea about what the interaction was supposed to be. And one other thing that I'll say, and this would probably be worth it to you to look at the website, which again, just Google activating Smithsonian Open Access and it will come up, is that we really, when we were evaluating the proposals, made it very clear that we really wanted there to be clear alignment between the kind of interaction being proposed and the outcomes for audience. And so choosing a specific kind of collection is sort of a critical middle ground. So there probably were proposals that were limited by the source of collections, but the ones ultimately that were successful most often had very specific idea about what collections to use, even if not specific objects, but how to use XYZ collection. And Ryan, I'm sure you have thoughts on this too.
Definitely. As I mentioned, part of the launch was establishing new platforms and workflows to allow each museum to continue to add to the collection in their normal day-to-day work. But there is a rigorous kind of research and vetting process or criteria that all objects undergo. So we can only release open access, if they're out of copyright, if they don't fringe on a whole number of metrics, but also including objects in particular that may have either cultural or sensitive either descriptions or depictions in those images. So there are definitely objects or trademarked items that just aren't able to be released open access, hence the 29%. But we're also researching and adding new objects as we move along. So in the chat, I did put links both to the open access FAQs that describe that research and that kind of discussion framework that happens around the decision to if and when and how to make an object open access. But we've also found, both in this project as well as with other collaborations we've done with university groups looking at our collections, that it is hard when you're doing big data or data modeling or machine learning to parse through our collections in this kind of a skewed view of the information because of that limitation. So one thing we are hoping to do is open up our API to include all of our metadata. So even if certain objects or assets may be open access, at least the data that is free and open around it is still pushed through that application programming interface. So if you are running programmatically certain prompts or queries against that, that it's a truer depiction of the information and the research that we have done. But yeah, it's definitely something we are investigating and open, of course, to hearing how other institutions have approached that, and to make it as meaningful and to make those connections as readily available as possible. I know we're short on time, so I did put my email as well in the chat if you want to continue the conversation. But the next question is, have you surveyed your commission creators about their thoughts on the process? What worked and what might be rethought?
We have surveyed our commission creators, and overall, they were pretty happy with the results. I mean, there were definitely some areas of program management in terms of just things like kind of scheduling and coordination. There was like quite a lot of that throughout the process that was complicated for as many creative teams as we had. And, you know, moving a meeting, which because of the complexity of managing a program like this, and that did have to happen, moving a meeting was, I mean, as I'm sure you all know, scheduling meetings with 20 to 30 people is an ordeal. And when there's multiple meetings with that many people, or on average a meeting with like 4 or 5 people multiple times a week that sometimes need to be scheduled, there was just like a non-trivial scheduling burden that I think the creators felt. And also, you know, there's still kind of some, I mean, there were a lot of really, I think, beneficial outcomes in terms of relationships and in terms of the creators being able to navigate the process of working with a large organization like the Smithsonian. But interestingly, despite our kind of best efforts to make a lot of that bureaucratic stuff easier for the creators, it was still a struggle for them. And so one of the things that also we're thinking about is, if we're doing a bunch of work to improve the bureaucratic piece on our side, but the creators are still feeling like that's really burdensome, I think that's just sort of a question we have to ask ourselves when working in this nimble way. What does it mean to, whether an entire reimagining or just like, how can we design processes in an organization like the Smithsonian, which is sort of by definition not so nimble, but obviously there's a lot of like interest and objective to make it more so. But yeah, it was really super thankful that we were able to do the thorough evaluation that we did. And it was HG & Co, Kate Haley Goldman and team who did that evaluation. They did a really outstanding job. And then last, there was one more question about thinking about digital preservation commitments for tools like these. So I'm just going to say a quick thing and then would love for Ryan to take that. But I think that we're not actually thinking about digital preservation for these tools at the moment because they're sort of falling under the heading of prototype. And so because we needed to be able to step away from a lot of the heavy obligations associated with development of tools like these, at this point, we're sort of comfortable with the idea that the prototype exists, that at a certain point, we're going to stop displaying the prototype, and then the creative team will have it and they'll continue to move it forward or they won't. But kind of thinking forward in terms of, you know, when we figure out which and if and, you know, how to kind of advance the prototypes, and there quite a few of them that still are, we're exploring different lives for inside the Smithsonian. I think at that point, we'll take on a digital preservation kind of question. But yeah, Ryan, I would love to hear your thoughts too.
Yeah, and in terms of open access specifically, we all, you know, research and metadata descriptive practice as a whole around objects is kind of an evolution, and language changes, the ways of describing changes. So we're hoping that our new platforms can capture and layer that information on, especially in terms of some of those cultural sensitivities I mentioned earlier. We're considering content statements, et cetera, so we can preserve a trail of that kind of didactic language in preservation, but in a purely more traditional digital preservation sense of our collections as a whole. That's something that we don't really have the perfect answer for right now. There are different investigations and pilots happening at the various museums, but the Smithsonian has established a data governance working committee looking just at that, how we can look at best practices, our own internal research, and make sure that all objects as well as digital surrogates are stewarded and preserved in the best way possible. So again, we would love to hear your thoughts and what works well for you as we have those conversations.
Thanks everybody so much. I think we're at time. We are in fact at time, but thanks everyone so much for listening, and please feel free to share questions with us. I am not presently in the chat, but I will find the chat and I will put my email in there. But in case you want to reach me, it's Ginsberg, Ginsberg @si.edu. Thanks again.